The Widow Who Never Wept, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with a widow whose grief never showed. While the village accepts her quiet composure, Miss Marple begins to wonder if her silence is hiding something far more troubling. Before we uncover the truth behind The Widow Who Never Wept, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1. The Widow Who Never Wept. Ashcombe had always been the sort of village where nothing remained secret for very long. News travelled from the church porch to the baker's counter before the morning bread had cooled. By afternoon, every garden gate seemed to have its own quiet discussion. So when Sir Edward Blackwood was found dead in his bed at Ashcombe Manor, the whole village seemed to fall into silence first and gossip second. The doctor declared it a sudden failure of the heart. A sad end, certainly, yet something about it refused to settle comfortably in people's minds. The funeral took place 3 days later beneath a low grey sky. Rain drifted gently across the old churchyard, soft enough to blur the distant hills without driving anyone indoors. Friends, neighbours, servants, and curious strangers filled every pew. Sir Edward had been wealthy, respected by some, feared by others, and impossible to ignore. Everyone expected the same thing from his widow: a trembling voice, a lowered head, a handkerchief pressed against tear-filled eyes. Instead, Mrs Eleanor Blackwood sat perfectly still through the entire service. Her face remained calm, her hands rested quietly together. She never cried, not once. That single detail spread through the village faster than the funeral procession itself. By evening, the tea-room buzzed with whispered opinions. Some believed she had never loved her husband. Others insisted the shock had simply left her empty. A few claimed grief could wear many faces. Yet every conversation ended at exactly the same place. She never wept. It became less of an observation and more of an accusation. Before long, people spoke of the widow with greater interest than the man who had died. Miss Marple listened to the chatter without joining it. She sat near the window with her knitting resting comfortably in her lap while the rain tapped against the glass. Now and then she glanced towards the villagers, as though each careless remark were another stitch in a much larger pattern. At last she folded her work neatly and spoke in her quiet, thoughtful way. "People often expect grief to perform for an audience," she said. "Real sorrow rarely worries about appearances." The room grew still for a moment. Then the whispers returned, softer than before, though no less certain. Late that evening there came a firm knock at Miss Marple's cottage door. Inspector Harris stepped inside, carrying his wet hat beneath one arm and an expression that suggested he had misplaced something important. He accepted a cup of tea, but scarcely touched it. After a long pause, he looked towards Miss Marple and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "It seems that Sir Edward did not die naturally." Miss Marple laid her knitting aside. So Sir Edward didn't die naturally. The inspector slowly shook his head. No, tests found poison. For several moments neither of them spoke. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily through the silence, while the rain continued outside. Miss Marple gazed into the fire, her thoughtful eyes reflecting the quiet flames. Then she reached for her coat with the smallest of smiles. "I believe," she said gently, "it's time I met the widow who never wept." Chapter 2. The Silence Inside Ashcombe Manor. Ashcombe Manor had always carried an air of quiet dignity, But after Sir Edward's death, it felt strangely hollow. The long corridors echoed with every footstep. Heavy curtains dimmed the afternoon light, and the grandfather clock in the entrance hall had stopped, as though time itself had decided to wait. The servants spoke only in whispers. Whenever Miss Marple appeared, conversations ended at once. It wasn't simply a house in mourning, it was a house guarding something. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood received Miss Marple in the drawing-room, overlooking the rain-soaked gardens. A small fire glowed gently in the grate, though it did little to warm the room. The widow poured tea with calm, steady hands and invited her guest to sit. There was no sign of fear in her face, no hurried excuses, only quiet exhaustion, the sort that comes after carrying a burden for far too long. "I imagine the whole village believes I poisoned my husband," she said at last. "They believe many things," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "Facts usually arrive after the gossip." The widow gave a tired sigh and looked out through the rain-soaked gardens. "They've judged me because I didn't cry. They expected a broken widow. Instead, they saw a woman who simply sat in silence." She paused before speaking again, choosing her words with care. "Edward wasn't always cruel. We had happy years once, but little by little he changed. He questioned every penny I spent. He decided who I could visit and who could visit me. Even the servants feared upsetting him. By the time he died, I had already grieved for the man he used to be. There was nothing left to weep for." Miss Marple didn't interrupt. She simply watched the widow's face. Some people worked very hard to appear innocent. Mrs. Blackwood wasn't trying to appear anything at all. That, Miss Marple thought, was worth remembering. While Inspector Harris questioned the servants upstairs, Miss Marple wandered quietly through the manor. She passed Sir Edward's study, where every paper sat in perfect order, then continued into the library. Shelves of old books stretched from floor to ceiling, each covered with a fine layer of dust. Almost every book, that is. One large history volume looked noticeably cleaner than the rest. She carefully removed it. Behind the book stood a tiny brown glass bottle, empty. Moments later, Inspector Harris entered the room with a satisfied smile. "So that's where the poison was hidden. Looks like the widow made a mistake." Miss Marple looked at the bottle for several seconds before gently shaking her head. "I don't believe so." The inspector frowned. She pointed towards the wooden shelf behind it. "Notice the dust. The book has clearly been moved recently, but the dust around the bottle hasn't been disturbed. If Mrs. Blackwood had hidden it herself, she'd have brushed the shelf without meaning to. Someone placed this here very carefully. Someone wanted us to find it." The inspector's smile slowly disappeared. "So we've been following exactly the trail the killer wanted." "I'm afraid we have," Miss Marple replied. As she returned the history book to its place, a folded railway ticket slipped from between the pages and drifted onto the carpet. She picked it up and unfolded it slowly. The date printed across the top matched the morning Sir Edward Blackwood died. More interesting still, the name written on the back belonged to a man who had confidently told Inspector Harris he'd never set foot inside Ashcombe Manor.
Chapter 3. The Truth Behind Dry Eyes. The following evening, Inspector Harris gathered everyone inside the drawing-room at Ashcombe Manor. Rain tapped gently against the tall windows, while the fire crackled in the grate, filling the room with an uneasy warmth. Mrs. Blackwood sat quietly beside the window. The butler stood near the door with folded hands. The housekeeper looked down at the carpet. Across the room stood Mr. Charles Whitmore, Sir Edward's solicitor, calm on the surface, but noticeably restless whenever anyone looked his way. Inspector Harris cleared his throat. "Miss Marple believes she knows what happened." Several curious faces turned towards the elderly lady. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair and rested one hand on the back of it. "Everyone has spent the past few days asking the wrong question," she said gently. "They kept asking why Mrs. Blackwood never cried. They should have been asking who wanted everyone to notice that." The room fell silent. The empty bottle behind the library book wasn't hidden to conceal the crime. It was hidden to be discovered. It pointed every suspicion towards the widow before the investigation had properly begun. Mr. Whitmore forced a small smile. "That's an interesting idea, but ideas aren't evidence." "No," Miss Marple replied. "The railway ticket is." She reached into her handbag and unfolded the ticket she had found inside the history book. "You told Inspector Harris you spent the morning of Sir Edward's death in London, yet this ticket proves you arrived in Ashcombe that very morning. You visited the manor before anyone knew Sir Edward was dead." The solicitor's face lost its color. Inspector Harris stepped forward. "You lied." For several long moments nobody spoke. The only sound came from the rain outside and the slow ticking of a small clock on the mantel. At last Mr. Whitmore lowered his head. "Sir Edward discovered I'd been stealing from his investments for years. He planned to dismiss me and report everything to the authorities. If that happened, my life would have been over." "So you poisoned him," the inspector said. The solicitor gave a slow nod. "I added the poison to his morning medicine the day before. Then I hid the bottle behind the library book after his death. Once I heard people talking about Mrs. Blackwood not crying, I knew they'd suspect her instead of me." Mrs. Blackwood closed her eyes for only a moment. "I didn't weep because I'd already spent years mourning the man my husband used to be," she said softly. "People mistook peace for guilt." No one argued with her. Inspector Harris quietly placed Mr. Whitmore under arrest. This time he needed no further questions. The solicitor walked from the room without another word, his footsteps fading into the long corridor until only silence remained. Miss Marple picked up her knitting bag and made her way towards the front door. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. A pale evening sun broke through the clouds and spread across the wet gardens. She paused for one last glance at the old manor. People think tears reveal the truth. Quite often they only hide it. If you enjoyed solving this mystery, don't forget to subscribe for more Miss Marple stories. Leave a comment telling me when you realized who the real killer was, or whether the widow fooled you too. Until next time, remember this: in the quietest village, behind the kindest smile, another secret may already be waiting.